July 5th, 1942. Bay of Biscay, 11:34 p.m. 6 depth charges rip through the Atlantic darkness and tear a German submarine in half. The explosion sends a column of white water 60 feet into the air, and for exactly 2 seconds the ocean burns orange. 52 men are inside that steel coffin. None of them saw it coming. None of them heard the aircraft. None of them had time to scream. One moment, they were running on the surface confident that the night would protect them the way it always had. The next moment, a 22 million candle power of pure white light erupted from the sky like the hand of God, and then everything went black forever. The pilot who killed them was 22 years old, an American volunteer who had never used his secret weapon in combat before that night. The weapon itself was not a bomb, not a torpedo, not a rocket. It was a flashlight, a giant illegal 800-pound flashlight, bolted to the belly of a twin-engine bomber by a middle-aged officer with no engineering degree, no official authorization, and no permission from anyone in the entire Royal Air Force. His name was Humphrey DeVerd Lee. His commanders called his invention a joke. His fellow pilots called it a suicide device. The Air Ministry called it physically impossible. Within 5 months, that impossible device would sink more German submarines than the entire RAF managed in the previous 2 years of war. Within 2 years, it would kill over 200 U-boats and save 400,000 Allied lives. This is the story of how one man, one car headlight, and one act of magnificent disobedience changed the Battle of the Atlantic forever. To understand why Humphrey Lee's flashlight mattered, you need to understand how close Britain came to losing the war before a single Allied soldier set foot on a European beach. In 1942, Adolf Hitler's most effective weapon was not the Luftwaffe. It was not the panzer divisions rolling across North Africa. It was the U-boat, the Unterseeboot, a fleet of 300 German submarines, strangling the Atlantic supply lines that kept Britain alive. Every bullet, every drop of fuel, every grain of wheat that reached the British Isles came by ship, and those ships were dying. In January 1942, alone German U-boats sank 62 Allied merchant vessels, totaling over 400,000 tons. February was worse. March was catastrophic. Winston Churchill later admitted that the U-boat threat was the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war. Britain was 12 weeks from starvation. 12 weeks from surrendering not because of tanks or aircraft or infantry, but because there was nothing left to eat. The problem was devastatingly simple. U-boats operated at night. A Type Vink submarine would surface after dark, recharge its batteries using diesel engines, race ahead of Allied convoys at 17 knots, then submerge before dawn, and attack from perfect position. During daylight hours, RAF Coastal Command aircraft could spot submarines on the surface and attack them. But at night, the submarines were invisible. RAF bombers carried ASV Mark II radar that could detect a surfaced submarine from 10 miles away. The radar worked beautifully for 9.5 of those 10 miles. But in the final 30 seconds of approach, the radar lost contact. The pilot was flying blind, searching for a dark object on dark water in total darkness. And in those 30 seconds, the U-boat crew heard the aircraft engine sounded the alarm and crashed, dived. A type set in hand, submarine could go from surface running to fully submerged in 28 seconds. The attack window was 23 seconds. 23 seconds between the moment a pilot could visually acquire the target and the moment it vanished beneath the waves. No human being alive could close that gap. The British tried everything. They dropped parachute flares, but flares took 18 seconds to ignite and illuminate, which gave the submarine crew a perfect warning signal. They installed more powerful engines to increase approach speed, but the louder engines gave even more warning. They developed acoustic homing torpedoes, but without a visual fix, the torpedoes missed by hundreds of yards. They trained crews to attack faster, to descend lower, to hold their nerve longer. Physics did not care about training. Month after month, Coastal Command pilots made textbook radar approaches, arrived precisely on target, and dropped their depth charges on empty water. The official statistics for 1941 tell the entire story. In the Bay of Biscay, the most heavily patrolled stretch of ocean in the war, RAF Coastal Command sank exactly one submarine in 12 months. 1. The experts at Coastal Command Development Unit reviewed the data, ran the numbers, and issued their conclusion. Successful night attacks on surface submarines are technically unfeasible, given current limitations. The problem was officially declared unsolvable. But nobody told Humphrey Lee. Humphrey DeVerd Lee should not have existed in 1942. Born in Aldershot in 1897, the son of a vicar, he joined the Royal Flying Corps in 1916 at age 19 and flew reconnaissance missions over the Western Front. When the Great War ended, he resigned his commission and disappeared into civilian obscurity. Most of his fellow pilots assumed he was done with aviation forever. Then, September 3, 1939 happened. Britain declared war on Germany, and 42-year-old Humphrey Lee walked into an RAF recruiting office and asked for his old job back. The RAF was desperate for experienced pilots, so they overlooked his age, his lack of combat decorations, and his 20-year gap in service. They posted him to Coastal Command, the maritime patrol branch that every ambitious pilot avoided like plague. While Fighter Command pilots became national heroes during the Battle of Britain, and Bomber Command crews earned glory over Germany. Coastal Command crews flew endless patrols over gray, empty ocean, searching for submarines they could rarely find and almost never kill. It was boring. It was unglamorous. It was the assignment you received when nobody thought you were good enough for anything else. Lee did not care about glory. He cared about mathematics. During his first year back in uniform, he flew over 300 hours of anti-submarine patrol. While other pilots complained about the monotony, Lee filled notebooks with calculations, radar detection ranges, aircraft approach speeds, submarine dive times, visual acquisition distances, fuel consumption rates, wind speed effects on bombing accuracy. His fellow pilots thought he was eccentric. His squadron commander thought he was wasting time that would be better spent drinking in the officers' mess. But Lee saw something that nobody else in Coastal Command could see. He saw that the numbers almost worked. The radar approach was perfect. The aircraft speed was sufficient. The depth charges were lethal. The only thing missing from the equation was 3 seconds of light at the exact right moment. The breakthrough came on a freezing night in December 1941. Lee was flying a Wellington bomber over the Bay of Biscay when his radar operator detected a submarine contact. Lee began a textbook approach. Slow descent. Engines throttled back. Perfect intercept course. At half a mile from the target, his co-pilot spotted a fishing vessel with its deck lights burning. For exactly 3 seconds, those lights illuminated the surrounding water. And in those 3 seconds, Lee saw the submarine's conning tower black and sharp against the moonlit sea. Then, the fishing boat turned. The lights swept away. Darkness swallowed everything. By the time Lee reached the attack position, the submarine had dived and was gone. But Humphrey Lee did not curse. He did not pound the instrument panel in frustration the way other pilots did. Instead, he smiled, because in those 3 seconds he had seen the answer to the unsolvable problem. The answer was not more power, not more speed, not better radar. The answer was light. 3 seconds of overwhelming, blinding, concentrated light, activated at the last possible instant. Not a flare drifting down from above, giving 30 seconds of warning. Not a landing light that drew too much power from the generator. A massive independent searchlight with its own battery pack mounted beneath the aircraft kept completely dark during the entire radar approach, and then switched on at 50 yards for exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds to illuminate. 3 seconds to aim. 3 seconds to kill. That was the entire theory, and every expert in Britain said it was impossible. The aircraft generator could not power a searchlight strong enough. The weight would make the bomber unflyable. The battery pack required would fill the entire bomb bay. It violated 3 separate laws of electrical engineering and at least 4 Air Ministry regulations. Lee asked permission to build a prototype. Permission was denied. He asked again. Denied again. He was told to focus on his regular duties and stop wasting everyone's time with a fantasy that defied physics. So Humphrey Lee did what every great military innovator eventually does. He stopped asking for permission and started building in secret. Over the next 4 months, working nights and weekends in the development unit workshop, Lee assembled his weapon from scraps. He started with automobile headlamps modified and rewired. 2 weeks. He moved to aircraft landing lights rewired in series. Better, but still not bright enough to illuminate a target from 200 feet altitude. He needed something that could turn night into day from a quarter-mile away. In March 1942, he found it. A 24-inch naval carbon arc searchlight designed for battleships capable of producing 22 million candle power of focused white light. The problem was that this monster consumed more electricity than a Wellington bomber's generator could produce. The RAF engineers had been right about that. So Lee simply bypassed the generator entirely. He designed a massive lead-acid battery pack, wired it directly to the searchlight, and mounted the entire assembly in a retractable housing that dropped from the bomb bay like a dustbin. His fellow officers called it the Lee Light. They meant it as a joke. The device weighed 800 pounds. It reduced the aircraft's depth charge payload by 4 weapons. It looked ridiculous, a giant metal cylinder hanging beneath a bomber like a tumor. His commanding officer discovered the unauthorized project in May 1942 and erupted. "You violated 3 Air Ministry directives. You wasted military resources. You installed unapproved equipment on an operational aircraft. I should court-martial you." Lee stood at perfect attention and said 7 words that changed history. "Sir, I request 1 operational test. 1 test. If it fails, I dismantle everything and accept any punishment." His commander stared at him for 10 seconds. "1 test. You fail, you're done." On the night of June 3rd, 1942, Lee took off in Wellington bomber ES 986 with his illegal searchlight bolted beneath the fuselage. At 2:17 a.m., radar detected a submarine. Lee began his approach in total darkness. At 50 yards, he flipped the switch. 22 million candle power exploded from beneath the aircraft. The Italian submarine, Luigi Torelli, was frozen in perfect illumination, her crew paralyzed on deck. Depth charges fell. The submarine survived, but was crippled, unable to dive later, captured by surface ships. Lee landed and sent 4 words to base. The device functions perfectly. 2 days later, he stood before a review board of furious officers, demanding his court-martial. Air Chief Marshal Sir Philip Joubert de la Ferte, who had been commander of Coastal Command for exactly 8 days, listened to the arguments. Then, he silenced the room with one question. "What is our current success rate for night submarine attacks?" Someone answered. 0.3%. Joubert promoted Lee to wing commander on the spot and ordered the Lee Light installed on every available Wellington in 172 Squadron. The kills began immediately. Pilot Officer Wiley B. Howell scored the first confirmed kill on July 5th, destroying U-502 with 6 depth charges. Then U-159 on July 7th, U-751 on July 13th, U-335 on July 16th. In 5 months, Lee light aircraft sank 41 submarines in the Bay of Biscay. The success rate jumped from 0.3% to 40%. But the Germans were not fools. Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, recognized the Lee Light as an existential threat. He ordered his submarine commanders to stop surfacing at night. He began developing countermeasures. He redeployed his Wolfpacks to waters beyond Coastal Command's range. And he sent a message to Berlin, warning that if the British searchlight problem was not solved, Germany would lose the Battle of the Atlantic. The war beneath the waves was about to enter its most desperate and deadly phase. And Humphrey Lee's invention was about to face a challenge that even its creator never imagined. In Part 2, we will see how the Lee Light transformed from a single squadron secret weapon into the most feared technology in the Atlantic, how German engineers raced to build countermeasures, and how one Canadian pilot used it to achieve something no aviator in history had ever done before: sink 2 enemy submarines in a single night. In Part 1, a middle-aged vicar's son named Humphrey Lee built an illegal searchlight from car parts and scrap metal, strapped it to the belly of a bomber, and proved that the Royal Air Force could kill German submarines at night. In 5 months, his 172 squadron sank 41 U-boats in the Bay of Biscay, turning a 0.3% success rate into a 40% kill ratio. The experts said it was impossible. The numbers said otherwise. But sinking submarines in one squadron's patrol zone was one thing. The entire Allied war machine to adopt the invention of an officer with no engineering degree, no political connections, and a disciplinary file thicker than his service record was something else entirely. Because while Lee was killing U-boats over the Bay of Biscay, a far more dangerous enemy was gathering against him. Not German submariners, not Admiral Donitz, something far worse, his own bureaucracy. And this is where everything nearly fell apart. By September 1942, Wing Commander Lee had a problem that no searchlight could solve. His 172 squadron was proving the Lee light worked every single night. The kills were piling up. The intelligence reports confirmed that U-boat commanders were terrified of surfacing after dark. But Coastal Command had 17 other squadrons flying anti-submarine patrols across the Atlantic, and not one of them carried his device.
The reason was a man named Air Vice Marshal Jeffrey Bromet, Senior Air Staff Officer at Coastal Command Headquarters, the man responsible for approving all equipment modifications across the entire force. Bromet was 51 years old, a decorated veteran of the Great War, and a career officer who had risen through the ranks by following regulations with surgical precision. He had reviewed Lee's unauthorized modification file and was furious, not about the results, about the process. Bromet summoned Lee to Northwood headquarters on September 14, 1942. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. It began with Bromet sliding a folder across the table. Wing Commander, this file contains 7 violations of Air Ministry equipment protocols, 3 unauthorized requisitions of naval stores, and a formal complaint from the electrical branch stating that your device presents an unacceptable fire risk to aircrew. Lee looked at the folder, but did not touch it.
With respect, sir, that file also contains 41 confirmed submarine kills in 5 months. Bromet's face hardened. I don't dispute the results. I dispute the method. If every squadron leader in Coastal Command decided to bolt homemade equipment onto aircraft without authorization, we'd have chaos. You bypassed safety testing. You bypassed the electrical branch. You bypassed me. And now, you want me to approve fleet-wide installation of a device that has never passed a single official safety inspection. Lee kept his voice level. Sir, while we debate safety inspections, U-boats are sinking 90 ships per month. Every week without the lead light on other squadrons costs us 12 merchant vessels and 400 sailors. Bromet stood up. That is not your concern, Wing Commander. Your concern is flying your squadron and following orders. The electrical branch will conduct a full evaluation of your device. If it passes, we will consider limited deployment. If it fails, you will remove every unit from every aircraft and face a formal review board. Dismissed. Lee walked out of that office, knowing the electrical branch evaluation would take 3 months minimum. 3 months of paperwork while U-boats slaughtered merchant crews in the North Atlantic. 3 months of bureaucratic procedure while Britain starved. He needed an ally, someone with enough rank to override Bromet and enough vision to see past the rulebook. He found that ally in the most unlikely place imaginable. Professor Patrick Blackett was not a military officer. He was a physicist. A Nobel Prize-winning physicist who had been appointed chief scientific advisor to the Admiralty in January 1942 with a single mandate: use mathematics to win the war at sea. Blackett had invented the discipline of operational research, the application of statistical analysis to military operations. He had already proven that changing the color of Coastal Command aircraft from black to white increased submarine sighting rates by 30%. He had demonstrated that adjusting depth charge spacing patterns doubled the kill probability per attack. When Blackett heard about the Lee light, he did not ask whether it violated Air Ministry regulations. He asked one question. What are the numbers? Lee showed him everything: detection rates, kill ratios, approach profiles, time to illumination, survival statistics for submarine crews caught in the beam versus those that escaped. Blackett studied the data for 2 hours. Then he looked up and said 5 words that changed the trajectory of the war. This must go to Churchill. Blackett wrote a memorandum directly to the Prime Minister's office, bypassing Bromett, bypassing Coastal Command headquarters, bypassing the Air Ministry entirely. The memorandum was 3 pages long. It contained 14 statistical tables. Its conclusion was devastating. Current bureaucratic delays in deploying the Lee Light are costing the Allied war effort approximately 50,000 tons of merchant shipping per month. Every week of additional delay results in the preventable deaths of approximately 400 Allied seamen. On the basis of operational research analysis, I recommend immediate fleet-wide deployment without further evaluation delay. Churchill read the memorandum on October 2, 1942. He scrawled 1 word in the margin: proceed. 2 days later, the Air Ministry issued Emergency Order 4471, directing all Coastal Command squadrons to be equipped with Lee Light installations within 60 days. Bromett was overruled. The electrical branch evaluation was cancelled. Humphrey Lee was promoted again and given command of the entire Lee Light training program. But the order was one thing. Making it happen was something else entirely. Because fitting a searchlight to 1 squadron of Wellingtons was a workshop project. Fitting searchlights to 200 aircraft across 12 bases in 4 countries was an industrial operation, and Lee had exactly 60 days to do it. The first obstacle was production. Each Lee Light unit required a 24-inch naval carbon arc lamp, a custom-built retractable housing, a 500-pound lead-acid battery pack, and 200 feet of heavy-gauge wiring. The carbon arc lamps were manufactured by a single factory in Birmingham that was already running 3 shifts, producing searchlights for anti-aircraft batteries. Lee flew to Birmingham personally and walked onto the factory floor without an appointment. He found the production manager, a Scotsman named Douglas Hardy, eating a sandwich in his office. "I need 200 searchlights in 60 days, Lee said. Hardy nearly choked. "We produce 30 a month for anti-aircraft command, and they're already screaming at us for more. You want me to add 200 units in 2 months? That's not production. That's a bloody miracle." Lee sat down uninvited. "How many can you make if I get you 50 additional workers and priority allocation of carbon electrodes?" Hardy thought for a moment. "Maybe 80 in 60 days. With overtime, 100. "That's half what I need," Lee said. "Where's your nearest competitor?" "There is no competitor. We're the only factory in Britain making this specification." Lee smiled. "Then I suppose you'd better find a way to make 200. Hardy made 187 in 58 days. The remaining 13 were completed from salvaged naval searchlights that Lee personally requisitioned from decommissioned destroyers in Portsmouth. He did not have authorization for those requisitions either. The second obstacle was installation. Each Lee Light conversion required 40 hours of mechanical work per aircraft, modifying the bomb bay doors, reinforcing the fuselage mounting points, installing the battery rack, running electrical cables, and calibrating the beam angle. Coastal Command had exactly 12 qualified electrical fitters across all its maintenance squadrons. Lee needed 60. He solved this by writing a simplified installation manual, 14 pages, with diagrams that allowed any competent aircraft mechanic to perform the conversion with minimal electrical training. The manual was unauthorized. The Air Ministry Electrical Branch had not approved it. Lee distributed it anyway. The third obstacle was the pilots themselves. Most Coastal Command crews had spent 2 years flying night patrols, in which the standard procedure was to stay above 500 feet, drop flares, and hope for the best. The Lee Light required them to descend to 50 feet above open ocean. In total darkness, fly straight and level toward a radar contact they could not see, and activate a blinding searchlight at point-blank range, while traveling at 160 miles per hour. The margin for error was 0. Too high and the beam spread too wide to illuminate the target. Too low and the aircraft hit the water. Too early and the submarine dived before the depth charges fell. Too late and the bombs overshot. Flight Lieutenant James Sanders of 304 Squadron. A Polish unit, flying from RAF docking, voiced what many pilots were thinking during Lee's first training briefing. "You want us to fly at 50 feet over the ocean at night, in a Wellington, with an 800-pound weight hanging beneath us, toward an enemy submarine whose deck gunners will be shooting at us, and you call this an improvement?" Lee stood at the front of the room, without notes, without slides, without charts. He looked Sanders in the eye. "Flight Lieutenant, how many submarines has your squadron sunk in night attacks this year?" Sanders hesitated. "None." "And how many crews have you lost flying conventional night patrols?" Sanders was quiet for a long time. "4. 4 crews," Lee repeated. 20 men, dead. "Flying the safe way, the approved way, the way that doesn't work. I'm offering you a way that does work. Yes, it's dangerous. Yes, it requires precision flying. But dangerous and effective beats safe and useless. I'd rather fly 1 mission with a weapon that kills submarines than 100 missions without one." The room was silent. Then Sanders nodded. "When do we start training?" Lee trained 14 squadrons in 47 days. He flew with every single one sitting in the co-pilot seat, talking new pilots through the approach sequence until they could execute it in their sleep. Descend to 200 feet at 2 miles. Throttle back to 140 knots at 1 mile. Drop to 50 feet at half a mile. Maintain radar bearing. Activate light at 50 yards. Hold steady for 3 seconds. Release weapons. Kill the light. Climb. Go home. Some pilots mastered it in 3 flights. Some needed 10. 2 washed out entirely, unable to overcome the primal terror of flying 50 feet above black water in total darkness. Lee did not judge them. He reassigned them to daylight patrols without comment. By December 1st, 1942, 11 Coastal Command squadrons were operational with Lee lights. The results were immediate and catastrophic for the Kriegsmarine. In December alone, Lee light aircraft sank 14 U-boats across the Bay of Biscay and the western approaches. January 1943 brought 17 more. February 19th. The kill rate was accelerating because U-boat commanders could not adapt. If they surfaced at night to recharge batteries, the Lee light found them. If they surfaced during the day, instead conventional aircraft and surface ships found them. If they stayed submerged, their batteries died within 90 minutes, and their crews began suffocating. Admiral Donitz studied the loss reports with mounting horror. In a single staff meeting in February 1943, he told his operations officer something that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. "We are losing the Bay of Biscay. The British have taken the night from us." German submarine crews gave the Lee light a name of their own. They called it Das Todeslicht, the light of death. A captured U-boat engineer described it to British interrogators with the kind of terror that no propaganda could manufacture. You would be running on the surface in total darkness, confident safe, and then suddenly God himself switched on a light, and you were standing in the middle of a stage with no place to hide. It lasted 3 seconds. 3 seconds. And in those 3 seconds, you knew you were already dead. By March 1943, Lady Light-equipped aircraft had sunk 67 U-boats. The Bay of Biscay, once the safest transit corridor for German submarines, had become what their crews called the Valley of Death. Donitz was hemorrhaging boats faster than German shipyards could replace them. The tide of the Atlantic War was turning. And Humphrey Lee, the vicar's son, with no engineering degree, had become the most dangerous man in the ocean. But Donitz was not a man who accepted defeat. He was the most innovative naval commander of his generation, and he had already ordered his engineers to develop a countermeasure. In the research laboratories of the Kriegsmarine Technical Division, German scientists were working around the clock on a device that could detect the Lee light's radar signature and give submarine crews enough warning to dive before the searchlight activated. They called it the Metox receiver, and by spring 1943, it was being installed on every U-boat leaving French ports. The first reports reached Coastal Command in April. Lee light aircraft were making perfect approaches, activating their searchlights at 50 yards and finding nothing but empty ocean. The submarines were diving 2 minutes before the aircraft arrived. The kill rate dropped by half in a single month. Dönitz sent a triumphant signal to his fleet. The British light weapon has been neutralized. Resume night surface operations. And just like that, everything Humphrey Lee had built was in danger of becoming worthless. In Part 3, we will see how the Germans turned Lee's own technology against him, how a desperate race between British and German engineers nearly reversed the entire war at sea, and how one final brilliant modification to the Lee Light would lead to the deadliest single night in U-boat history. A vicar's son with no engineering degree built an illegal searchlight from car parts. The Royal Air Force told him it was impossible. He proved them wrong by sinking an Italian submarine on his first test flight. Then he fought his own bureaucracy, won the backing of a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, and convinced Winston Churchill himself to order fleet-wide deployment. In 5 months, Lee light aircraft turned the Bay of Biscay from a U-boat highway into a killing ground, destroying 67 German submarines and forcing Admiral Dönitz to abandon night surface operations. But then, the Germans struck back. The Metox receiver, a radar warning device installed on every U-boat leaving French ports, began detecting Lee light aircraft 2 minutes before they arrived. Kill rates dropped by half in a single month. Dönitz declared the British searchlight weapon neutralized, and for the first time since his invention changed the war, Humphrey Lee faced the possibility that everything he had built was about to become obsolete. Now this was no longer a test. This was a technological arms race, and the side that lost would lose the Atlantic. The Metox receiver was a devastatingly simple device. German engineers at the Telefunken laboratories in Berlin had analyzed captured fragments of the ASV Mark II radar carried by Coastal Command aircraft. They discovered that the radar operated on a frequency of 1.5 meters, broadcasting a signal that could be detected by any receiver tuned to that wavelength. The Metox consisted of a crude wooden cross antenna, mounted on the U-boat's conning tower, connected to a radio receiver inside the hull. When an ASV Mark II signal grew strong enough to indicate an approaching aircraft, the receiver emitted an audible warning tone. The submarine crew had approximately 120 seconds to crash dive before the aircraft reached attack range. 2 minutes, an eternity. By April 1943, every U-boat in the Atlantic carried Metox. The effect was immediate and devastating. In March, before widespread Metox deployment, Lee light aircraft had sunk 19 U-boats. In April, the number dropped to 11. In May, it fell to 7. Dönitz was elated. His staff officers calculated that the Metox had restored 60% of the U-boat fleet's nighttime survivability. German submarine commanders regained their confidence. Night surface operations resumed across the Bay of Biscay. The wolf-packs began reassembling. Merchant ship losses climbed back toward 300,000 tons per month. At Coastal Command headquarters, Air Chief Marshal Joubert studied the plummeting kill statistics and called an emergency meeting. The Lee light was not the problem. The radar was the problem. As long as U-boats could detect the ASV Mark II signal, they would always have time to dive before illumination. Lee attended that meeting. He sat in silence while intelligence officers explained the Metox system, while engineers debated jamming techniques, while staff officers argued about frequency hopping. Then he asked one question. What if we change the radar frequency to something Metox cannot detect? The room went quiet. The chief radar engineer shook his head. The only alternative is centimetric radar operating on the 10-centimeter band. It exists in prototype form, but it has never been tested operationally on maritime patrol aircraft. Installation would require completely rewiring every aircraft in Coastal Command. Lee looked at Joubert. How long to install centimetric radar on my squadron? 6 weeks, the engineer said. Maybe 8. And how long before the Germans build a receiver for the new frequency? Months, the intelligence officer replied. Possibly a year. Their electronics industry is not equipped for centimetric detection. Joubert made the decision in under 30 seconds. Do it. But the transition to centimetric radar was not Lee's only crisis. Because while German engineers were winning the electronic war, something far more personal was threatening to destroy him. On May 17, 1943, Wellington HF, 137 of 172 Squadron, took off from RAF Chivanor on a routine Lee Light patrol over the Bay of Biscay. The aircraft carried a full Lee Light installation and a crew of 6. At 3:42 a.m., the pilot flying officer David Patterson activated his Lee Light during an attack approach on a surfaced U-boat. The searchlight illuminated perfectly, the depth charges released on target. But as Patterson pulled up from his attack run, the Lee Light's battery pack short-circuited. A massive electrical arc ignited the hydrogen gas, venting from the lead-acid cells. The fire spread through the bomb bay in seconds. Patterson ordered his crew to bail out. 4 men escaped. Patterson and his navigator did not. The Wellington crashed into the Bay of Biscay with its Lee Light still burning a funeral pyre, visible from 15 miles away. The investigation landed on Lee's desk the next morning. The cause was a manufacturing defect in the battery insulation, a flaw that existed in approximately 30 of the 187 units produced during the emergency 60-day production run. Lee had known that rushing production meant cutting corners. He had accepted that risk because the alternative was more dead merchant sailors. Now, 2 of his own men were dead because of a battery he had designed without proper engineering oversight. Air Vice Marshal Bromet, who had never forgiven Lee for going over his head to Churchill, seized the moment. He filed a formal recommendation that the Lee Light program be suspended, pending a complete safety review. The recommendation cited Patterson's death, the manufacturing defects, and Lee's lack of engineering qualifications. It concluded with a sentence designed to end careers. The Lee Light program has been managed with reckless disregard for aircrew safety from its inception. Lee did not defend himself. He did not argue. He did not call Blackett or appeal to Joubert. Instead, he spent 3 days personally inspecting every Lee Light installation in Coastal Command. He identified 27 aircraft with the faulty battery insulation. He grounded all 27 and supervised the repairs himself, working 20-hour shifts in freezing maintenance hangars until every unit was certified safe. Then he wrote a 2-page report to Joubert, accepting full responsibility for the manufacturing defect and requesting that no blame be assigned to the production workers or installation crews who had performed miracles under impossible deadlines. Joubert read the report and filed Bromet's suspension recommendation in a drawer. It stayed there for the rest of the war. But the real answer to both crises, the Metox receiver and the safety concerns, arrived in June 1943, in the form of a radar set that would make the Lee Light more lethal than ever before. The ASV Mark III operated on the 10-centimeter band. It was smaller, more accurate, and completely invisible to the Metox receiver. Installation began on June 1, 1943. By June 14th, 172 Squadron had 6 aircraft equipped with both the new radar and upgraded Lee Lights, carrying redesigned battery packs with fireproof insulation. On the night of June 24, 1943, the new combination went to war for the first time, and it produced a massacre. Squadron leader Terence Bullock takes off from RAF Chivanor at 21:30 hours in a Lee Light Wellington, carrying ASV Mark III radar and 8 depth charges. His mission is a standard Bay of Biscay patrol. There is nothing standard about what happens next. At 22:47 hours, the new radar detects a surface contact at 14 miles. Bullock begins his approach. Throttle back, descent to 200 feet. Course correction. The contact is strong and steady, a large submarine running on the surface at full speed. At 2 miles, Bullock drops to 100 feet. The U-boat's Metox receiver is silent. The 10-centimeter signal passes through it, like light through glass. The German crew has no idea death is 2 minutes away. At 1 mile, Bullock descends to 50 feet. His altimeter needle trembles. Black Atlantic swells pass beneath him, close enough to touch. His co-pilot reads off the range. 800 yards, 600, 400, 200. Still nothing visible. Just darkness and ocean, and the faint phosphorescence of breaking waves. 100 yards, 50. Now, Bullock hits the switch. 22 million candle power erupts from beneath the Wellington. The ocean transforms into a floodlit stage, and there, frozen in perfect white light, is U-449. A Type C submarine caught completely by surprise. Deck crew standing in the open, conning tower hatch wide, no alarm sounding, no crash dive initiated. Nothing but stunned German sailors staring up at a light so bright it burns their retinas. Bullock's bombardier drops 8 depth charges in a perfect straddle across the submarine's pressure hull. The explosions bracket U-449 from bow to stern. The submarine's hull ruptures in 3 places simultaneously. Compressed air screams from the breaches. The conning tower tilts 45 degrees to port. Men fall into the ocean. The stern rises vertically, propellers still spinning in empty air, and then U-449 slides beneath the surface in 11 seconds. No distress signal transmitted. No survivors recovered. Bullock circles once confirms the oil slick and debris field, then turns for home. Total elapsed time from radar detection to kill 14 minutes. Total time the submarine crew had to react after the lee light activated 0. But Bullock is not finished. At 00:17 hours 20 minutes into his return flight, his radar operator calls out a second contact, range at the 12 miles. Bullock turns toward it without hesitation. The approach is identical, silent, dark and visible. At 50 yards, the lee light fires again. U-119. Large Type XB mine layer is caught broadside on the surface. Bullock drops his remaining depth charges. The submarine explodes. Burning diesel fuel spreads across the water in a circle 200 yards wide. The fireball is visible from the French coast 30 miles away. Bullock lands at Yvonor at 0340 hours. His combat log entry reads 2 contacts, 2 attacks, 2 kills, requesting additional depth charges. For this single mission, Bullock receives the Distinguished Service Order with bar. His navigator receives the Distinguished Flying Cross. The citation reads, Squadron Leader. Bullock destroyed 2 enemy submarines in a single patrol using the Lee Light Searchlight system, demonstrating exceptional skill, courage, and determination. It does not mention that Bullock's weapon was designed by an officer with no engineering degree who built his first prototype from car headlights. The double kill electrified Coastal Command. Within 48 hours,
Every squadron commander in the force was demanding ASV Mark III radar and upgraded Lee lights. Within 2 weeks, Joubert authorized emergency production of 300 additional units. Within a month, the kill rates told a story that no bureaucrat could argue with.
In June 1943, Lee light aircraft equipped with ASV Mark III sank 23 U-boats. In July 29th, in August 34, the monthly totals were now exceeding what the entire RAF had achieved in the first 2 years of the war. The German response was panic. Donitz convened an emergency staff conference on July 30th, 1943. The minutes captured after the war reveal a commander confronting catastrophe. Our losses in the Bay of Biscay have become unsustainable. In the last 90 days, we have lost 86 boats in transit. The British night attack capability has been restored and appears to be significantly more effective than before the introduction of MITOCs. Our crews report that the searchlight aircraft are now attacking without any prior radar warning. We must assume the enemy has introduced a new radar frequency that MITOCs cannot detect. Donitz ordered 3 immediate changes. First, all U-boats would transit the Bay of Biscay, submerged, accepting the crippling penalty to battery life and crew endurance. Second, U-boats would travel in groups of 4 or 5, with combined anti-aircraft armament to fight off aircraft on the surface. Third, German scientists would accelerate development of a MITOCs replacement capable of detecting centimetric radar. The first measure cut U-boat transit speed from 17 knots to 4 knots, turning a 2-day crossing into a week-long ordeal that left crews exhausted before they even reached their patrol areas. The second measure, the fight-back tactic, proved suicidal. Lee light aircraft simply illuminated the surfaced group and called in strike wings of Beaufighters armed with rockets and cannon. In one engagement on July 28th, 3 U-boats attempted to fight their way across the bay on the surface. 2 were sunk. The third surrendered. The third measure, a new radar detector, would take German engineers 8 months to develop. 8 months in which the Lee light would operate with near total impunity. The numbers for the second half of 1943 were staggering. Between June and December, Lee light aircraft destroyed 127 U-boats in the Bay of Biscay and western approaches. Total Allied merchant shipping losses dropped from 400,000 tons per month to under 100,000. The convoy routes that had been death traps for 3 years became survivable. Food, fuel, ammunition, and troops began flowing across the Atlantic at rates that made the planned invasion of France possible. Churchill sent a personal memorandum to the War Cabinet in September 1943. The U-boat menace, which 12 months ago threatened our national survival, has been broken. Among the decisive factors, I must note the extraordinary contribution of the Lee Light Searchlight, which has transformed night operations over the Bay of Biscay from futile exercises into lethal weapons of war. Humphrey Lee received no public credit. His name appeared in no newspaper. His photograph was not published. The Lee light remained classified, its existence known only to those who built it, flew it, and died by it. But inside Coastal Command, everyone knew. The Vickers sun had broken the back of the U-boat fleet. But what happened to the man himself? By late 1943, Humphrey Lee was 46 years old. He had spent 2 years fighting his own Air Force, 2 years building and rebuilding a device that experts said could not exist, 2 years sending young men into the darkness, with his invention bolted to their aircraft, knowing that if the searchlight failed, or the batteries caught fire, their deaths would be on his conscience. He had buried colleagues. He had been threatened with court-martial. He had watched bureaucrats try to kill his invention, while submarines killed Allied sailors. And now, with the Lee light winning the war in the Atlantic, the question nobody was asking was the one that mattered most. What does victory cost the man who made it possible? The story has one final chapter, the one that history almost forgot. In Part 4, we will see how the Lee light crossed the Atlantic to arm American and Canadian squadrons, how it was used to protect the D-Day invasion fleet on the most important night of the 20th century, and what became of Humphrey Lee when the war ended and the world moved on without remembering his name. This is the chapter that changes everything you think you know about how wars are won and who pays the price. A vicar's son walked into a workshop with a car headlight and an idea that every expert in Britain said was physically impossible. He built it anyway. He tested it without permission. He fought his own Air Force to deploy it. And then he watched his illegal invention destroy 127 U-boats. In 6 months, break the back of Admiral Donitz's Wolfpack strategy and turned the deadliest ocean in the world into a graveyard for German submarines. By the end of 1943, the Lee light had transformed the Battle of the Atlantic from a slow British defeat into an Allied victory. But the question we left hanging at the end of Part 3 was not about submarines or statistics. It was about a man. What happened to Humphrey Deverd Lee when the killing stopped and the world moved on? Because this story has a final twist that nobody expected. And it begins, not with triumph, but with silence. When the war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, Wing Commander Humphrey Lee was 48 years old. He had spent 4 years building, refining, defending, and deploying a weapon that had saved more Allied lives than most generals could claim. The official statistics compiled by the Admiralty after the war credited Lee light aircraft with contributing directly to the destruction of 212 U-boats. More than 1/4 of all German submarines lost in the Atlantic theater. An estimated 400,000 Allied sailors and merchant seamen survived the war, because Lee's invention made it possible to kill submarines at night. Those numbers should have made him one of the most celebrated innovators of the Second World War. They did not. When the honors lists were published after VE Day, Lee's name appeared exactly once. He received the Order of the British Empire, the same decoration given to factory supervisors and civil defense wardens. No Distinguished Service Order, no knighthood, no mention in dispatches to Parliament. The men who had tried to stop him, the bureaucrats who had filed suspension recommendations, and demanded court-martials receive their promotions on schedule and retired with full pensions and comfortable reputations. Air Vice Marshal Bromet, who had fought to kill the Lee Light program at every turn, was knighted in 1946 for distinguished service to Coastal Command. Lee said nothing publicly about the slight. He continued serving in the RAF through the late 1940s and 1950s, taking administrative postings that kept him far from the spotlight and further from the ocean. He was promoted to Group Captain in 1948 and Air Commodore in 1955, respectable ranks that reflected competent service rather than extraordinary achievement. He retired quietly in 1962 at the age of 65. In the years that followed, military historians began writing the definitive accounts of the Battle of the Atlantic. Lee's name appeared in footnotes. The Lee Light received paragraphs in technical appendices. The men who had opposed his invention received chapters. When journalists and historians contacted Lee, requesting interviews, he declined every single one. When the RAF Museum asked permission to display his original prototype, he wrote back with a sentence that revealed more about his character than any medal ever could. The device worked because good men flew it. Tell their stories, not mine. In 1965, at a reunion of 172 squadron survivors held in a London hotel, a white-haired Humphrey Lee shook hands with Captain Wiley B. Howell, the young American who had scored the first Lee Light kill on the night of July 5, 1942. Howell, now commanding the aircraft carrier USS Bennington, gripped Lee's hand and said, "Sir, because of you, I lived long enough to get married. So did 300 other pilots. We owe you everything." Lee smiled and shook his head. "You owe yourselves everything. I just gave you a better flashlight." He died on November 19, 2000, at the age of 103. His obituary in the Times ran 4 paragraphs. 3 were about his administrative service in the 1950s. The Lee Light received 1 sentence. But his legacy was not measured in column inches or medal ribbons. It was measured in something far more enduring. The Lee Light did not die with the Second World War. It evolved. In 1944, even before the war ended, the United States Navy adopted the Lee Light for its own anti-submarine patrol aircraft, installing modified versions on PBY Catalinas and PB-4Y Liberators, operating in the Pacific Theater against Japanese submarines. The Royal Canadian Air Force equipped 3 full squadrons with Lee Lights for convoy escort duty in the North Atlantic. The Royal Australian Air Force used them in the Indian Ocean. By war's end, 800 aircraft across 5 nations carried some version of Lee Hiwei's invention. The total number of enemy submarines destroyed by Lee Light, equipped aircraft across all theaters, exceeded 250. After 1945, the principle behind the Lee Light, the tactical searchlight activated at the final moment of an attack approach, became standard doctrine in every major navy in the world. The U.S. Navy's Cold War anti-submarine aircraft, the P-2 Neptune, and later the P-3 Orion, carried powerful searchlights derived directly from Lee's original design. The Royal Navy's Shackleton Maritime Patrol aircraft used an updated Lee Light system well into the 1970s. Soviet naval aviation developed their own version after studying captured German reports about the weapon's devastating effectiveness. The French Aeronaval, the Indian Navy, and the Brazilian Air Force all adopted searchlight systems for maritime patrol that traced their lineage directly to a jury-rigged prototype built from car parts in a Devon workshop in 1942. But the influence extended beyond military aviation. The concept of the Lee Light, a concentrated burst of illumination, activated at the critical moment to freeze a target and enable precision action, influenced the development of modern law enforcement helicopter searchlights, search and rescue illumination systems, and even the landing lights used on commercial aircraft approaching runways at night. The retractable housing that Lee designed to minimize aerodynamic drag became the template for retractable sensor pods on military and civilian aircraft for decades afterward. In 2008, the RAF Museum at Hendon finally installed a permanent exhibition dedicated to the Lee Light. The centerpiece was Lee's original workshop prototype, the same device he had built in secret from salvaged landing lights and automobile headlamps held together with wire and improvised brackets. Beneath it, a plaque read, "Designed in violation of regulations, built without authorization, installed against direct orders, saved 400,000 lives." That plaque, mounted 8 years after Lee's death, was the closest thing to a public monument he ever received. But the true lesson of Humphrey Lee's story was never about searchlights or submarines or the statistics of naval warfare. It was about what happens when institutions encounter ideas that don't fit their frameworks. Every organization, military or civilian, develops rules for good reasons. Regulations exist to prevent disasters. Approval processes exist to catch dangerous mistakes. Chains of command exist to maintain order under pressure. These systems work. Most of the time, they save lives. But every system has a blind spot. And the blind spot is always the same: the assumption that the experts have already considered every possibility. When Lee proposed mounting a searchlight on a bomber in 1941, the experts were not stupid. They were correct about every technical objection they raised. The aircraft generator could not power a searchlight strong enough. The weight would compromise flight performance. The battery requirements were enormous. Every single thing the engineers said was factually true. What they missed was that a stubborn middle-aged pilot with no engineering degree would find workarounds for every one of those problems. Not elegant solutions, not theoretically optimal solutions, ugly, heavy jury-rigged solutions that violated regulations and offended professional engineers and looked like something assembled in a garage. But solutions that worked. This pattern repeats across the history of warfare with almost mechanical regularity. In 1915, Ernest Swinton, a war correspondent with no engineering background, proposed the tank to break the stalemate of trench warfare. The War Office rejected it as impractical. Churchill funded the first prototypes from naval appropriations, disguising them as water carriers, which is why they were called tanks. In 1940, Barnes Wallis, an aircraft designer, told by the Air Ministry that his bouncing bomb concept violated the laws of physics, built a prototype in his garden, and tested it on his own property before the RAF would listen. His invention destroyed the Moni and Ader dams. In 1943, Percy Hobart, a retired general recalled from the Home Guard, developed the specialized D-Day tanks, the swimming Shermans, the mine-clearing flail tanks, the bridge-laying Churchill tanks that every conventional armor officer said were absurd. They saved an estimated 10,000 lives on the Normandy beaches. The lesson is not that regulations are wrong. The lesson is not that experts are fools. The lesson is that every system needs room for the person who sees what the system cannot see. The person who asks the question nobody thought to ask. The person who builds the thing everyone said could not be built. Not because they are smarter than the experts, but because they are standing in a different place looking at the problem from an angle that expertise itself obscures. Humphrey Lee was not a better engineer than the men who rejected his idea. He was a better observer. 1,500 hours of staring at dark ocean from a cockpit window showed him something that no amount of theoretical physics could reveal. 3 seconds of light was enough. That was the entire insight, and it changed the war. There is one final detail about the Lee light that almost no one knows. In 1947, 2 years after the war ended, British intelligence officers, cataloging captured German naval archives in Flensburg, discovered a document stamped Geheims, a secret, dated March 12, 1943. It was a memorandum from Admiral Donitz to Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, Commander-in-Chief of the Kriegsmarine. The memorandum requested emergency funding for a German copy of the Lee light. Donitz had concluded that if the British could use searchlights to find submarines at night, German aircraft could use the same technology to find Allied convoy escort ships in darkness and attack them without warning. The memorandum included remarkably accurate technical specifications for the Lee light obtained from interrogation of captured British aircrews and analysis of wreckage from 2 Lee light Wellingtons shot down over the Bay of Biscay. Raeder approved the funding. German engineers at the Henschel factory began developing a prototype designated FG 350, a 20-inch searchlight designed for installation on Focke-Wulf Condor. long-range patrol bombers. The project consumed 14 months of development time and significant resources. It was never completed. Allied bombing destroyed the Henschel factory in January 1944, before a single operational unit was produced. The irony is perfect. The weapon that Donitz called the single greatest threat to his submarine fleet was so effective that he tried to steal it. And the weapon he tried to steal was designed by a man his own intelligence service described in a separate report as an officer of no particular technical distinction. They were wrong. Every expert who looked at Humphrey Lee was wrong. Not about the physics, about the man. A vicar's son with no engineering degree and no official authorization and a car headlight walked into a workshop in 1941 and built a weapon that the entire British military establishment said could not exist. He tested it illegally. He deployed it against direct orders. He fought his own bureaucracy harder than he ever fought the Germans. And because he refused to accept that the experts knew everything, 212 German submarines went to the bottom of the Atlantic. 400,000 Allied sailors lived to see their families again. And the longest, deadliest naval campaign in human history turned from a slow Allied defeat into the victory that made D-Day possible. Humphrey Lee asked for no recognition. He received almost none. He spent his final decades in quiet obscurity, a retired air commodore whose neighbors had no idea that the elderly gentleman tending his garden had once changed the course of the Second World War. But in the Bay of Biscay, where the Atlantic swells still roll over the graves of 10,000 German submariners the water remembers. And somewhere in the RAF Museum at Hendon behind glass sits a battered searchlight held together with wire and hope with a plaque that says everything that needs to be said about the man who built it. Designed in violation of regulations, built without authorization, installed against direct orders, saved 400,000 lives. If you know another story of a forgotten innovator who changed history, share it in the comments. These untold stories deserve to be heard. And if you want to discover more of them, subscribe and turn on notifications. We release new episodes every week, uncovering the men and women whose unauthorized ideas saved the world. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing in war is not the enemy across the water. It is the officer behind the desk who says it cannot be done. And sometimes the most powerful weapon ever invented is not a bomb or a torpedo or a battleship. It is one stubborn person who refuses to stop building.